The UK tax burden is rising to the highest level since the Second World War. Despite a succession of chancellors promising tax cuts, the reality is we've had very significant tax rises. The IFS state that it will be a record-breaking parliament for putting up taxes. The only chancellor to actually cut taxes was Kwasi Kwarteng, whose unfunded tax cuts led to a crash in the bond market, a fall in sterling, and his resignation after just 38 days. But if no one likes higher taxes, why are they going up so much? And what about the future? With failing public services, a stagnant economy, and an ageing population, is the only alternative to have ever higher levels of taxes in the UK. In 2010, taxes were 33% of GDP. Now taxes are 37% of GDP. This is an average of £3,500 extra tax per household compared to the old level of taxes. Yet there are 7 reasons why permanently higher taxes are likely to be here to stay. In fact, taxes are likely to go up even more. Firstly, the UK tax burden has not been particularly high by international standards. The tax burden in the UK is currently lower than many European countries, though it is forecast to catch up by 2028. Interestingly, if we go back to the 1960s, the UK tax burden was one of the highest in the world, but since then has been overtaken by most European countries. An interesting question is whether this Scandinavian model of high tax and high spending is what the UK is likely to face in the future. Or is there a chance to emulate Ireland with a much lower tax rate? In the early 2010s, the UK tax burden was kept fairly low. It didn't increase like many European countries, primarily because of the austerity of the Cameron and Osborne years. But now, with the multiple costs of COVID, Brexit, ageing population, underinvestment in public services, and the energy crisis, taxes are having to rise fast to catch up. Secondly, a significant burden of recent tax rises has been due to inflation. Wage inflation has led to stealth tax rises for millions of households who have now entered into higher tax brackets. This is something known as bracket creep and will net the Treasury an extra £40 billion, much higher than initially planned. But whilst nominal wages rise, the cost of living and high inflation means that real incomes have stagnated, and this is why the tax rises are having such a big effect on disposable income. Thirdly, in recent years there's been a significant deterioration in public finances. Public sector debt has risen from 40% of GDP to 100% of GDP in quite a short time. Furthermore, another cost of inflation has been a surge in government debt interest payments. This is because many government bonds are index linked. So this means with higher inflation, the government have to pay more interest payments. And on top of this, interest rates have gone up too. So this combination of higher debt interest payments and higher inflation and the government's own fiscal rules means the governments have very limited room for manoeuvre. Even if the Chancellor wanted to cut taxes, they can't do so on current rules. This was the downfall of Truss and Kwarteng. If they had cut taxes back in 2010 when interest rates and inflation were very low, they probably would have got away with it. But in 2022, because of high inflation and high interest rates, it meant that their unfunded tax cuts were seen to be very risky. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, recently stated he would like to cut taxes, but it would be inflationary. This is the dilemma. The Bank of England have had 14 successive increases in interest rates to deal with the stubborn inflation. If Chancellor started cutting taxes, then this would cause more spending, and the Bank of England would have to increase interest rates even more. So if you cut taxes, with one hand you give, but with another hand, higher interest rates, it would be taken away. Fourthly, the past 10-20 years have seen years of austerity and underinvestment in public services. It's caused a backlog of capital investment and rise in waiting lists across the nation. For example, just last month, the concrete crisis caused many schools to be closed, even as the term started. And this is emblematic of the short-termism and lack of investment in many of the UK's public infrastructure. When you've cut investment for so many years, it becomes expensive to run running repairs. You could say austerity has become quite expensive. And even when the UK has managed to start public investment projects, it hasn't always been a great success. The cost of HS2 has soared much higher than initial estimates, partly because of inflation, but also because of the planning regulations and also all the additional costs of building tunnels, etc., to placate local constituencies who never really wanted the railway going through their backyard anyway. And fifthly, and very importantly, whilst UK voters would like lower taxes, we also expect good quality healthcare. In recent years, exacerbated by COVID, NHS waiting lists have soared. The crisis in the NHS is really quite visible. All of us, to some extent, have some personal experience of either struggling to get an appointment or nightmare 24 hours in A&E. And this shows the pressure that the healthcare system is under. And the problem is that it's unlikely to get better in the near future. We have an ageing population which needs more spending. We also have ever-growing number of treatments which are very expensive. Healthcare spending as a share of GDP has risen from 5% in 1990 to 12% at the height of COVID in 2021. Real spending per person has tripled in just 30 years. With total public health spending of $233 billion, it's unsurprising that taxes are having to rise to meet demand. In the post-war period, to some extent we were able to spend more on healthcare by cutting back on defence. But defence has now fallen to a level which is pretty bare bones, and some are wanting to actually increase spending on defence in the light of recent geopolitical events. But that easy way to cut spending is no longer there. The other canary in the coal mine is the UK economy. The post-war trend rate of economic growth was around 2.5%. And this meant that even if you kept tax rates the same, the government were getting more tax revenue, which is very convenient for any political party. But since 2010, productivity growth has slowed down quite dramatically. This is GDP per capita in the UK. And by the way, it includes recent upward revisions to GDP. The big picture is that the UK economy is just not doing very well. And this is very significant because if growth is not there, the only way to spend more money on the healthcare and welfare that we need is to increase taxes. And the big question is, can this poor economic growth be changed? Any politician will always talk about wanting to increase economic growth. But just because you want to increase growth doesn't mean it's easy to do it. If it was easy, it would have been done by now. Related to rising healthcare spending is a big surge in spending on pensions. In a time of inflation, the triple lock guarantee is quite expensive, an extra 10 billion this year. And the share of spending on pensions is going up. And as the population ages, this pressure will only increase. The only solution is to raise the retirement age or increase taxes on a shrinking working population to pay for the pension commitments we already have. And it's not just pensions. Under current trends, the OBR expect health and disability benefits to soar from 40 billion to 80 billion pounds. And this is a problem affecting the UK at the moment, a rise in long-term sickness that's really become more of a problem since COVID came in 2021. So this is a problem governments face. There's very strong upward pressure on spending from health, welfare and pensions. And this is just maintenance spending, just keeping up with demand. If the government wanted to revitalise the economy, level up the norths, invest in public transport and education, this would require even more spending. And there's even more bad news because traditional tax receipts are set to fall. Smoking rates are declining, people are drinking less, and as people switch to electric cars, receipts from petrol will fall quite rapidly. There will be a need for new taxes, and new taxes are always difficult to introduce. Also in the past, UK tax receipts were boosted by privatisation receipts, North Sea oil, even profit from quantitative easing. But all of this is coming to an end, with nothing left to privatise, North Sea oil drying up, and also even the government's budget forecasts for the coming years are based on extremely optimistic plans to cut spending, which will be actually very difficult to implement. After years of austerity and falling real public sector pay, there's very little fat left to trim. Even local councils from Surrey to Birmingham are facing a real financial crisis, and it will be central government and the taxpayer who will need to step in. What about the future of taxes under a Labour government? Traditionally, Labour are more willing to have high taxes, higher spending. So far, the Labour Party has been fairly conservative about spending. Plans for capital investment of around £25 billion a year are actually quite small. They'll do little to prevent the decline in capital spending as a share of GDP. Public investment is one area where the government could spend more by borrowing, because in theory higher investment will lead to higher growth and higher tax revenues in the future. But in today's political climate, the virtues of borrowing for investment are often quite hard to make. Now, in the year running up to the election, the Labour Party again have been very conservative, you could say, on planned tax rises. They have scrapped possible wealth tax and tax on higher earners. But if they win the next election, there will be expectations to try to overturn a lot of the declines in public services. There's all these ongoing rises in demand, and yet they'll want to do even more. And so this will be the difficult decision that they will face. They may not want to increase taxes, but if current trends continue, they will have no alternative but to raise taxes or disappoint people in things like spending on healthcare. So a good question the nation really needs to address is, which way do we want to go? Do we want to go down the Scandinavian model of having a good healthcare system and welfare state with high taxes? Or do we want to go down the US route of low taxes, lower spending, but also needing to get, say, private healthcare insurance, which is a kind of surrogate tax? But one thing's for certain, you can't have a European-style healthcare and welfare system on US tax rates. Now, some argue that maybe we should not look at Scandinavia, but look at, say, Ireland. They have a much lower tax burden as a share of GDP. And in recent years, they have accelerated past the UK economy. And it is more than just attracting multinational companies through very low corporation tax. This video goes into more detail of why the Irish economy has overtaken the UK economy.